Hi, welcome back to The Call of the Wild. Today I'm going to read Chapter 6, For the Love of a Man. When John Thornton froze his feet on the previous December, his partners had made him comfortable and left him to get well, going on themselves up the river to get out a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but with the continued warm weather, even the slight limp left him. And here, lying by the river bank, through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of birds and hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. A rest comes very good after one's traveled 3,000 miles, and it must be confessed that Buck waxed lazily on his wounds, healed, his muscles swelled out, and the flesh came back to cover his bones. For that matter, they were all loafing, Buck, John Thornton, and Skeet and Nig, waiting for the raft to come that was to carry them down to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who early made friends with Buck, who in a dying condition was unable to resent her first advances. She had the doctor trait, which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, so she watched and cleansed Buck's wounds. Regularly each morning, after he had finished his breakfast, she performed her self-appointed task, till he came to look for her misnotions as much as he did for Thornton's. Nig, equally friendly, though less demonstrative, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound, half deerhound, with eyes that laughed and boundless good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs manifested no jealousy towards him. They seemed to share the kindness and largeness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they enticed him into all sorts of ridiculous games in which Thornton himself could not forbear to join. And in this fashion, Buck romped through his convalescence and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was for his first time. This he had never experienced at Judge Miller's, down in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, with the judge's sons, hunting and trapping. It had been a working partnership. With Judge's grandsons, a sort of pompous guardianship. And with the judge himself, a stately and dignified friendship. But love that was feverish and burning, that was adoration, that was madness, it had taken John Thornton to arouse. This man had saved his life, which was something, but further, he was the ideal master. The men saw to the welfare of the dogs from a sense of duty and busyness expectancy. He saw to the welfare of his as if they were his own children, but he could not help it. And he saw further. He never forgot a kind greeting or a cheering word, and sit down for a long walk with them. Gas, as he called it, was as much his delight as theirs. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, the while calling him ill names that Buck knew were love names. But Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths, and at each jerk back and forth, it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was his ecstasy, and when released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes eloquent, his throat vibrant with uttered sounds, and in that fashion remained without movement. John Thornton would reverently exclaim, "God, you can all but speak." Buck had a trick of love expression that was akin to hurt. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth, and close so fiercely that the flesh bore the impress of his teeth for some time afterward. And as Buck understood the oaths to be love words, so the man understood this vain bite for a caress. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek those tokens. Unlike Skeet, who was wont to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till pelted, or Nig, who would stalk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee, Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager, alert at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, following it with keenest interest. Each fleeting expression, every movement or change of feature, or, as chance might have it, he would lie farther away to the side or rear, watching the outlines of the man and occasional movements of his body. And often such was the common in which they lived, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transit masters, since he had come into the Northland, had bred him a fear that no master could permeate. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrot and Francois and the Scotch half-breed had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times, he would shake off sleep and creep through the chill to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. But in spite of this great love he bore John Thornton, which seemed to bespeak the soft civilizing influence, the strain of the primitive which the Northland had aroused in him remained alive and active. Faithfulness and devotion, things born of fire and roof, were his, yet he retained his wilderness and willingness. He was a thing of the wild, come in front of the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the swift Southland stamped with the marks of generous civilization. Because of his very great love, he could not steal from this man, but from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate an instant, while the cunning with which he stole embedded him to escape detection. His face and body were scored by the teeth of many dogs, and he fought as fiercely as ever and more shrewdly. Skeet and Nig were too good natures for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But the strange dog, no matter what the breed or valor, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy or found himself struggling for life with a terrible antagonist. And Buck was merciless. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never forwent an advantage or drew back from a foe he had started on the way to death. He had lessoned from Spitz and from chief fighting dogs of the police and mail, and knew there was no middle course. He must master or be mastered, while to show mercy was a weakness. Mercy did not exist in the primordial life. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings made for death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law, and this mandate down out of the depths of time, he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-breasted dog, white-fanged and long-furred. But behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half wolves and half wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him, and telling him the sounds made by the wild life in the forest, dictating his moods, directing his actions, laying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him and beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of his dreams. So peremptorily did these shades beckon him that each day mankind and the claims of mankind slipped farther from him. Deep in the forest, a call was sounding, And as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and the beaten earth around it, and to plunge into the forest. And on he knew not where or why, nor did he wonder where or why, the call sounding imperiously deep in the forest. But as often as he gained the soft, unbroken earth and the green shade, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was nothing. Chance travelers might praise or pet him, but he was cold under it all. And from two demonstrative men, he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived to the long-expected raft, Buck refused to notice them until he learned they were close to Thornton. After that, he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, accepting favors from them as though he had favored them by accepting. They were of the same large type as Thornton, living close to the earth, thinking simply and seeing clearly, and they were swung to the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson. They understood Buck and his ways, and they did not insist upon intimacy such as obtained with Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among men could put a pack of Buck's pack in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day they had grub-sacked themselves from the proceeds of the raft, left Dawson for the headwaters of the Tana. The men and dogs were sitting in the crest of the cliff, which fell away straight down to naked bedrock 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge, Buck at his shoulder. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete to the experiment he had in mind. "Jump, Buck," he commanded, sweeping his arm out and over the chasm. The next instant, he was grappling with Buck in the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. "It's uncanny," Pete said, after it was over and they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. "No, it is splendid, and it is terrible too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid." "I'm not hankering to be the man that lays hands on you while he's around," Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head toward Buck. "By jingo," was Hans' contribution. "Not myself either." It was at Circle City ere the year was out. Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burton, a man evil-tempered and malicious, had been picking a quarrel with Tenderfoot at the bar, when Thornton stepped good-naturedly between. Buck, was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Buck struck out, without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning, and saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air, and he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but was hurled backward to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. But while a surgeon checked the bleeding, he prowled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A ministers' meeting called the spot, decided that the dog had sufficient provocation, and Buck was discharged, but his reputation was made, and from that day his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life in quite another fashion. The three partners were lining a long and narrow floating boat down a bad stretch of rapids in the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, scrubbing with a thin manila rope from tree to tree, while Thornton remained in the boat, helping its descent by means of pull and shouting directions to the shore. Buck on the bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot where a ledge of barely submerged rocks jolted out into the river, Hans cast off the rope, and while Thornton pulled the boat out of the stream, ran down the bank with the end in hand to snub the boat when it had cleared the ledge. This it did. It was flying downstream in a current as swift as a mill race when Hans checked it with the rope, and checked too suddenly. The boat flirted over, snubbed into the bank, the bottom up, while Thornton flung sheer out of it, was carried downstream toward the worst part of the rapids, a stretch wild water in which no swimmer could live. Buck had sprung in the instant, and at the end of the 300 yards, amid a mad swirl of water, he overhauled Thornton. When he felt him grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all of his splendid strength. But the process shoreward was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roaring, where the wild current went wilder and was rent in the shreds and spray with the rocks, which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over rock, bruised across the second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of the churning water he shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own, and swept on downstream, struggling desperately, but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeatedly, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high as though for a last look, then turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. They knew that the time a man could cling to slippery rock in the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could to the bank, for a point far above Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been scribbling a boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it should neither strangle him nor impede his swimming, and launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough to the stream. He discovered the mistake too late when Thornton was abreast of him, and bare a dozen strokes away while he was being carried helplessly past. Hans promptly stowed with the rope, as though Buck were a boat, the rope thus tightening on him in the sweep of the current. He was jerked under the surface, and under the surface he remained until his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered at his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to them, and they thought they could hear, not make out the words of it. They knew he was in his extremity. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet and ran up to the bank ahead of them, to the point of his previous departure. Again the rope was attached, and he was launched and again struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He would not be guilty of it as a second time. Hans paid out the rope, permitting no slack, while Pete kept it clear of coils. Buck held on until he was on a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned, and with the speed of express train, headed down upon him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a battering ram with the whole force of the current behind him, he reached up and closed with both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans snubbed the rope around the tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, strangling, suffocating, sometimes one uppermost and sometimes the other, dragging over the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and sags. They veered into the bank. Thornton came to, belly downward, and being violently propelled back and forth across the drift log by Hans and Pete. His first glance was for Buck, over whose limp and apparently lifeless body Nig was setting up a howl. When Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes, Thornton was himself bruised and battered, and he went carefully over Buck's body when he had been brought around, finding 3 broken ribs. "That settles it," he announced. "We camp right here." And camp they did, till Buck's ribs knitted and he was able to travel. That concludes what we're going to be reading today. Today's question is, how is Buck's relationship with John Thornton similar to and different from his relationship with Judge Miller? Thanks.